All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our conversation about unconscious bias and identity development and examination. This is part of a week-long series of conversations that we're having about inclusion and equity and justice here at Kansas State and the College of Architecture, Planning, and Design. A few announcements before we get deep into our conversation. I want to remind you all and let you know that this session is being recorded to be uploaded on to the college website, so people will have access to it after the session. So we want to make sure that you all know that before we get started, if that changes your camera or viewing preferences as we go forward. My name is Carrie Zimmerman. I'm delighted to be your facilitator and conversation partner today, and have thoroughly enjoyed all of the conversations that we have had this week as we're talking about what it means to build and structure and live inside of communities that are welcoming to all, spaces where people can be their best selves and thrive and grow and become both the people and the professionals that are going to add to this world that we share and live in together. Today's conversation is about unconscious bias, and we're going to do a lot of digging into what that means. And we started this week with some definitions about language, some foundational language around the issues of equity, justice, inclusion, diversity, knowing that as people, as a community, it's hard for us to have in-depth conversations when we're not even necessarily sharing the same understanding of topics or ideas or even vocabulary. So those were really helpful conversations, and I have so appreciated in every session the amount of interaction, the level of investment and sincerity that have come from you all as participants. So I just want to voice my gratitude for that in all of the sessions that we've had. Again, reminder that we're recording the session. We'd love for you to have your camera on if you can do that. This will be an interactive session. As we go through this, we will break up into some smaller breakout rooms partway through the session. If you can have your cameras on so you all can see one another, that would be great. I invite you to participate in the conversation. It is much richer when we all are sharing our voices and our perspectives. So you have the ability to mute and unmute yourself. I invite you to join in the chat. I invite you to speak or raise your hand or participate in whatever way is most comfortable for you as we go through this morning's conversation about unconscious bias and identity development. So thanks for being here. Thanks for participating and being part of the conversation. I'm going to pull up some definitions, some data, some science behind what this is, what this unconscious bias concept even is. Studies have been going on for a couple of decades, neurologically, physiologically, psychologically, about how our brains work, how we filter all of the messages that come into us on a daily basis. This is going to give us some good grounding in terms of thinking through how it is we interact with one another, how we begin to understand the messages that are both internal and external that fly at us every time we have any kind of conversation, interaction with another person or a group of people. So let's get right to it. Okay. So in our earlier conversations, if you all were a part of that, we did a lot of definitions. We talked about the language around the difference in equality and equity. We talked about what a prejudice is. We talked about what a bias is. And so this definition we're going to revisit as we talk through what unconscious or implicit bias is. And so at its most basic, a bias is a tendency to prefer one thing or one person over another. It is a prejudice in favor of or against a thing, a person, a group, compared with another. Generally, we consider that to be unfair. Think about biases in this way. We all have them. It's the ways in which our brain makes a judgment about a person, a situation, an item. They are internal, they're part of who we are. It's the way that our brain filters information. There's a lot wrapped up in it. We all have them. Some of them, we have positive biases towards certain things. We have negative biases towards certain things. So it's any prejudice that we have compared with something else. And there are two types of biases. There's conscious bias that's also referred to as explicit bias. These are the things we know about. We know we have an affinity towards something. We like something more than something else. We believe that one thing is stronger, better, more valuable than something else. We know about those. Those are our conscious biases. Then we have our unconscious bias, also called implicit bias. These are our leanings, tendencies, prejudices that we don't necessarily know that we have, that we're unaware of. Thinking about biases, people often say, oh, if you have a bias, that's you have a negative feeling about something. Not always. A bias can be positive or negative. It's simply a value that you are placing on one side or the other of what a bias is. Often when we think about bias, we are thinking about ethnicity or race or gender, but it's important to understand that biases can come from any frame, any identity, any structure. It can be age, gender identity, religion, weight, sexual orientation, accent, national origin, personality trait, hair, music choice. We can have multiple biases in lots of ways. So these biases are social stereotypes. They're about certain groups or individuals. We hold these unconscious biases about lots of different groups and identities. It helps us filter all of the messaging that's coming to us from lots of different ways. If we were able to process all of the messaging that comes at us, it would take years for us to work through all of the things that are coming into our brain at one time. Scientists and neurologists have estimated that with a single interaction with one other person, 11 million pieces of information come at you at once. You are taking in from every sense around you, sight, hearing, smell, touch, messagings in your history, pieces of information that you have gotten over the years. Our brains are wired to take that 11 million pieces of information and filter it down into 40 or 50 that we can process. Of that 40 or 50 that we can process, only a handful, about 10 or 11, are we conscious that we're processing. So in a split second, from the time the interaction starts, you are taking in these millions of neurological messages and senses, and your brain is flying very quickly to take shortcuts. The shortcuts are important. This goes back to the part of our brain where survival lives, where fight or flight exists. This goes way back to the very first humans when they had to decide quickly, is this animal a danger? Like, do I need to run from this? Or am I the person, am I stronger than what's coming at me? Can I fight or should I flee? If we waited to process the 11 million pieces, the saber-toothed tiger would have eaten us. And so our brains quickly developed in a way that we were able to process it. So some of these we know and some of them we don't. The unconscious piece are those stereotypes that come from our messaging that's outside our conscious awareness. We all have these. Some are positive and some are negative. And they come from our tendency to need to categorize, to put order, to organize the world that we live in. So they happen without our knowing. Often when we think about bias, we have tended to connect it with morality. We don't want to be biased when someone says, oh, they're biased. We have tied it to prejudice, and prejudice is at a negative connotation. But we all have bias, and it's not about morality, immorality. It's not being a good or bad person. It's about, this is what it is to be human in these bodies with these brains. We have filters, and how we navigate those is how we begin to manage how we interact with other people, how we begin to manage decisions that we make, how we begin to manage the ways in which we interact with other people. So here's some of the science behind what we know. Unconscious biases develop at an early age. They think somewhere around middle childhood, and they appear to develop across our youth. As we begin to understand differences among people, as we begin to hear more messages from people around us that we trust, as we begin to think about having more interactions with the outside world, outside of our nuclear family, whatever that looks like, we begin to develop senses about safe and not safe, smart and not smart, valuable, not valuable. These biases that we have, they have real implications on our behavior. They decide whether we enter a space or leave a space. They help us decide whether to move forward or move back, whether we value another person or interaction or not. They also are malleable. And I think that's the hope around some of this. When we talk about unconscious and we don't have control over these filters and images that can come in, it can feel like, okay, what do I now do about this? If I know I have this coming in, am I just helpless to these, internal biases that come up? But actually we're not. They are malleable. We can take some steps to understand them, to know what filters we're viewing the world through, and think about how we can minimize the impact of them. You can't necessarily shift or change or erase what that is, but once we're aware of them, once we've taken some time to think through what those are, what the filters are, then we can really take some steps to minimize that impact. All right, let's talk a minute about filters. These are the ways in which all of us view the world, view our surroundings, view the people and places that we come into contact with on a daily basis. And the filters come from every part of our identity, every part of our experience, every piece of who we interact with and where that comes from. And so as we think through what our own filters are, this is where the personal work of this comes in. We have talked a little bit about the science, a little bit about the background, but everyone has a different set of filters and they're individual. And if you were at some of our earlier sessions, we talked about some of the pieces of our identities and what that does, how that helps us navigate our world and find our place. And so in thinking about everything from your type of family that you grew up in, what part of the country or world you first lived and moved around in, as you think about your educational setting, faith backgrounds, gender, age, relationships with other people, they all become a layered filter that changes how we view the outside world. Instagram has given us this immediate way to filter our pictures. When I was a kid, I'd have my little disposable camera and I'd go take my pictures and we had to drop them off at the drugstore and you never knew what you were going to get back. You drop off your 24 pack of film at the you know, at the drugstore and you're like, oh, do I pay extra for the 24-hour return? Generally, you waited, I don't know, 3 or 4 days, a week, for this like roll of film to come back to you. Most of you are too young to know what I'm talking about, but you never knew what you were going to get when these pictures in a paper envelope came back to you. Generally, 3/4 of them were garbage. I mean, it was like the sky and your thumb and blurry or overexposure. You didn't know if you'd gotten a good picture or not until days later. Now, we see the picture. If it's not good, we take another, we take 11, we shift, we tilt, we change the light. And even once we've taken the picture, we're like, all right, now let's make it look the way we really want it to look. And we start dropping in light filters, color filters. We sharpen, we defocus, we change backgrounds, we add colors, we can add text. And so what we're able to present to the world is not what our eye first saw. It's not what our cameras and our phones first picked up. We are physically dropping in filters to change what the image is. Well, our brain is doing that way before we had iPhones doing it. Our brains have been doing that for us before we ever got to this place of having the technology to be able to do it manually. And so for us, we're going to spend some time today thinking about our own filters, really examining as a person what the filters are in which we see the world. So this is going to require us to think about the several different types of biases. The one that we generally talk about are identity biases. You know, this can be gender or age or name or beauty. There are multiple ways in which we would think, oh, I have a bias toward this or a bias against that. You know, I learned talking to one of the groups of students this week that, you know, models in architecture, you know, they're it's 6 feet tall is what it's supposed to be. And I was like, oh, it's because we have this bias toward height. And here's an interesting statistic about our height bias. This is an American statistic. In the United States, 14% of men are over 6 feet tall, 14%. Yet 60% of male CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are over 6 feet tall. So somewhere, unconsciously, consciously, we have attributed something about height to leadership, something about size to power, to influence. And so when you look at those numbers, you think, wow, height doesn't actually have anything to do with your ability to lead a Fortune 500 company. But somewhere through the messaging, that has added to what we think and do and feel. Name bias, when we're talking about identities. MIT and the University of Chicago have both done studies about name bias. And they sent out blind resumes, thousands of them, identical resumes, using duplicate resumes, using what we would call traditionally white or traditionally black names. So names like, you know, Gregory and Emily were on one set of resumes, and, you know, Jamal or Nikisha, names we might traditionally associate with Black individuals, on the identical set of resumes. Even companies who had stated hiring, open, accessible hiring practices, that stated it was their goal and desire to have more diversity, to be more inclusive in their hiring practices, 50% more callbacks came to the resumes of the people who had white, typically white identifying names. 50% more, even among companies who stated we're looking for more diversity. So again, with identity bias, it is everything from names, height, beauty, gender, age. You know, there are settings where older people are considered wise or they're considered over the hill. You know, we spent a lot of time with some, you know, by boomer conversation, you know, earlier this year, and dismissal of people of a certain age. We also frequently dismiss youth as not having experience, not being qualified, needing to earn their spot, not on merit, but simply on the amount of hours that you have existed on the earth. Positive and negative bias exist. So identity is the one that people are most familiar with. When we talk about a bias, identity is the one that comes in. There are multiple others that get into the more complex parts of unconscious bias. And so I'm going to go through these next 5. Affinity bias, confirmation bias, attribution bias, then the halo effect and horn effect. All right, first up is affinity bias. In some areas, they also call this similarity bias. So this simply means that if you and another person, or you and another group of people have some similarities, you have some connections, you tend to have a positive thought about them. If you find out something as simple as, oh, we're from the same state, awesome. Like there's a connection, there's this sense of warmth and let me ask more questions. I will give you an example of this. I grew up in North Carolina, and we have a statewide hatred of South Carolina. You know, a lot of states have that with, you know, a neighbor. Mississippi and Alabama have got that. You know, Texas and Oklahoma have got it. But North and South Carolina, there is one of those affinity biases. And last night I was talking to Tom, and he's like, oh, I grew up in North Carolina. And I was like, me too. And so we immediately started talking about it. Now, if he had said, oh, I grew up in South Carolina, I would have said, oh, that's all right, I like you anyway. And so anytime we find a connection, whether it's a background or an experience, we have any one of our identities that we share with another person, we're drawn to them. We are more likely to think good things about them. We are more likely to be helpful to them. Any kind of connection is an affinity bias. The opposite of that is when you don't share any shared experience, or you have a negative feeling about someone's identity. That also immediately comes into play, where regardless of that person's qualifications or personality or abilities, people get dismissed because of dissimilarities, just not being able to find a connection. So that's an affinity bias. Confirmation bias. This is where filters come into place a lot. This is where we draw conclusions about a person based on what we think is good or right. So if I think that one political belief is right and another one is wrong, when someone affiliates one way or the other, it may not have anything to do with what their job or performance is. I have drawn some conclusions based on my own beliefs and prejudices. So it just confirms what I think. Oh, if I think this is important, this matters, this has worth, and someone else has a different side of that, it just confirms for me, oh yeah, this is right or this is wrong. This is also where we tend to gather up with people who are most like us. This is where, you know, we've talked about photo filters. Let's talk about filtering our social media accounts, filtering who we listen to, filtering who we get news from, who we believe, who we don't. And so when we're looking for confirmation, if another person that we value says something that we already agree with, that becomes stronger to us. It simply confirms what we have already believed. All right, now we have attribution bias. This is where we judge a person based on prior performance, an earlier interaction. We have formed an opinion in the past, and we don't let that person get away from it. This can happen when we may have heard something about a person before we ever met them, And suddenly we have made a judgment about them based on other people that they're around, who their friends are, what previous jobs that they have had. We may have seen someone once on a terrible day and we've decided they're a terrible person. And so we're attributing to them past experiences, and we're unable to allow for that to shift. We're unable to create space for that person to change that perception. So we are attributing to them some prior event, whether we had personal observation of it or not. And it often gets people stuck in previous behaviors. This can happen frequently in education. If you have a terrible performance on a first project, test, exam, paper, it can be hard to get away from that. You may fall into a category of underperformer, not going to make it. And even when a second performance is strong, exceptional, there may be a filter from that where you're not allowed to have a second chance. It happens in jobs. If you drop the ball on something, you may do it once. But if people are unaware of their filters about that, it doesn't matter what 9 other good things you do, it may hold you back. Similarly, it happens to us and we do it to other people. Now, this one can be difficult in terms of past performance, past perceptions. Maya Angelou said to us, when people teach you who they are, believe them. And there's some power in that in terms of relationships and how you have strong interactive relationships, but it also can be limiting in not allowing people to have space to grow and change and shift. So as we think about inclusion, as we think about community, as we think about justice and equity and diversity, often attribution bias comes in when people are lumped into past behavior, even of other people. It gets attributed to them and our perception of them. All right, let's talk about the halo effect and the horn effect. So I put a dog up here because I don't know how much time you spend searching through stock images and photos, but it's so many white people. If you look for, a halo, what you get is a bunch of white people with halos on their heads. But dogs, I feel like, are just a good, they're just a better way to do this when we're talking about pictures. So the halo effect and the horn effect, I think, are fascinating. So the halo effect is where we tend to give people credit because we like them. And if you already have good feelings about someone, if you think they're smart or impressive, or you believe what they believe, if you already have had some confirmation bias with them, you've already had some, ways that you think, oh yeah, we're alike. I get this. I have this affinity bias with them. Then when they do something good, we tend to make it better. We're like, yes, that was excellent. If they do something neutral, we give them more credit because we like that person. This happens in politics frequently. If there is a politician, a leader, who we like and agree with, if they do something stupid, we'll dismiss it. We'll be like, that is not that big a deal. They just misspoke. They just said, they didn't mean that. That's not what they meant. However, if it is a person that you don't like, the horn effect comes into play. So the horn effect is when we view someone negatively. We know something unpleasant or negative about them, and then whatever they do, we value it less. It's worse. So if it's a person that you already don't think very highly of and they do something not great, then you're like, of course, let me tell you what the effect of this is. And we rattle off all the ways that they are terrible and awful and worthless. If a person that you give great value to and a person that you don't care about one bit does the exact same thing, we as individuals will have different responses to those two people based on this halo and horn effect. We give more credit, more chances, more opportunity to have a do-over to people that we feel this way about. People that we love and care about or think are right or smart or impressive. People that we have the horn effect toward, we don't give as many second chances or any second chances. And we tend to attribute a mistake or a misstep to their value as a person or their rightness or wrongness. Our filters keep us from having that just be a single incident that's part of their long story. We tend to, if it's a good thing and we like that person, say, of course, they did a good job. They always, and we add that into their scroll of good things they have done. If a single incident of a person that is, this poor bulldog down here with these, devil horns on, does a single incident, we don't chalk it up to a single incident. We add it to the long tally that we're keeping of reasons of why that person isn't worthy of our time or forgiveness or second chance or promotion or leadership role or good grade. So this horn and halo effect comes into play frequently as we think about our filters and biases and how that come into play. One more statement about horn and halo. I want to be very clear that I do not have more love for this golden retriever than I do for this precious bulldog. They were just the photos that came up of dogs with halos and horns. I'm not making a value statement about different types of dogs based on what kind of pet that you have. So let's talk about, we've talked some of the science of where these filters and our biases come into play. So now that we know this, let's talk about some real world implications of this. I shared a little bit about the studies of height and name and how our biases tend to impact hiring. So these, I shared these the first evening that we were together, the first afternoon, and I want to revisit them from the Department of Labor. So 72% of women report instances of gender discrimination and harassment. We can begin to pick out what filters come into play here. This becomes identity filter. It's a gender filter. When we talk about that 81% of people of color have been the only person of their race in a college or graduate classroom, filters have to come into that in terms of both how they are viewed and how they view their faculty. The fact that almost 70% of postgraduate students of color have never had a faculty member of their race teach them. When we go back to the affinity filters of, does someone understand you? Do you have a shared experience, background, identity with another person? It may be harder to immediately build a relationship, to immediately have positive feelings about someone. When we talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, 72% of LGBTQ plus people feel uncomfortable sharing personal details about relationships, family structure, gender identity at work because of prior experiences they have had facing some kind of bias or prejudice or discrimination about their sexual orientation, relationship status, gender identity. Let's talk about abilities, access. 82% of people with a physical disability report being passed over for jobs, promotions, or projects. We can easily think of what biases and filters come into play. They're not able to do it. They'll need extra accommodation. And often people wouldn't say any of these things out loud. Their conscious brain would not say, oh, I need to make sure I, hire this type of person because they are better, more qualified. Our brains are filtering because of lots of other information that comes into play. So I said there's hope about this. I said there are ways that we can identify, we can think about what our filters are. And it starts in a couple ways. It starts with us thinking about our own identity. It starts with us considering what our background has been. So we're going to spend some time right now thinking about this, about our own journeys, our own identities, because they do help frame our own story. Your story is yours and yours alone. It cannot be anyone else's. We walk our path with other people at different junctures, but the way in which we view and feel and experience the world is unique to us. And it's complex, and there's value in that. There's value in understanding how every part of our story, every piece of our lived experiences adds something to how we view the world. Understanding those helps make sure that we're using those experiences in a way that benefits us and our fellow human beings. We don't often have control of some of the things that come at us. We have more control over the time we spend thinking through those, the time that we spend processing them, the time that we spend understanding how that helps us shape and see the world around us. That's where we have some influence. That's where we can begin to shift and think through how we interact with other people. So this is what we're going to do right now. I'm going to put us into some breakouts, into some small groups. I'm going to turn the camera, the share screen off for just a minute and explain what we're going to do. So we've talked about biases, we've talked about filters, and about how our own identities and experiences have helped build that layer upon layer of the way that we view the world. You know that in your everyday coming and going, the brain is processing quickly, whether you're walking towards someone, away from them, whether you think positively or negatively about a person. That comes from our past experiences. It comes from messages that we get through the media, through family members, through people that we respect. It all comes at us and our brains begin to filter that. So here's what we're going to do in our breakout rooms that we're going to go to. I'm going to put up on the screen a list of identity categories that you can think about. And let me go ahead and do that so you can be thinking about it as I'm talking and before I put you into your groups, because I don't think you're going to be able to see it once I put you into your small groups. I want you to get a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, or have a place where you can type out your own personal list. But I want you to make a list for yourself about the identities that you claim for yourself. This can be anything from your family structure, a faith background, gender identity, your age or race or ethnicity, experiences you've had, accomplishments, socioeconomic. I mean, there are multiple ways that you can think about identity. Everybody's list is going to be different. Everyone will have different perspectives around this. And so I want you to just make a list, every identity that you claim for yourself. Your list isn't going to look like anybody else's, and you can choose to share as much or little of your list with your group as you want to. So I'm going to give you a minute or two right now before I put you into groups while this list is still up, and let you begin to make your list and think through, all right, what are the identities that I claim for myself? Think through what, where you fall into that and where this comes and goes for you. So I'm going to give you a minute or two to write your list. And then I'll put you into some breakout rooms. And then I want you to have a conversation with each other about your list, about your identities. If you want to read your list to the people in your group, that would be a great way to have this conversation and start thinking through who you all are as individuals and what your filters are. So keep making your list. remembering that these categories are not all inclusive. There are many, many other categories you might think through as you consider your identities. Okay, in about a minute, I'm going to divide you into breakout rooms. Again, once you get to your room, share part or all of your list with the folks that you are in your room with. Introduce yourself to everyone. I know some of you know each other, but you probably won't know everyone in your room. So introduce yourselves, turn your cameras on if you're able. That makes that conversation much better. And just share whatever part you're comfortable sharing of this identity list. You don't need to read all of it. But if you do read your list, they tend to be beautiful poetry when we start listing off some of the makeup of who we are and what we claim about ourselves, knowing that the sum of our parts is there's so much more to us than just these simple things. All right, I'm going to put us in breakout rooms. Spend about 10 minutes in your room, and I'll send a message when it's time to come back. Everyone should be getting a room assignment. You can just click on join. Mm. Welcome back. We've got folks still popping back in. I think in 10 seconds, they're all going to come flying back in. It's always jarring when the room ends for you and shoots you back into the other room.
What were your qualities or your identities?
Was that question for me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh gosh, thanks for asking. Oh, my list is so let me do this off the cuff. I would say I am white, I'm a woman, I'm Southern, I'm educated, I'm a political junkie, I'm a writer, I'm right-handed, I'm cisgendered, I'm heterosexual, I'm an orphan, I'm a traveler, I am an Enneagram 7 and an ENFP on the MBTI. I am a sister. I'm a godmother. I am a person questioning my faith and spiritual background. I'm a feminist. I'm a lover of these two chipmunks outside my window that I've been training nuts out of my hand all pandemic. Yeah, that's the start of my list. Thanks for asking. So welcome back. I'm gonna put us back on gallery view for a minute so I can see all of your faces. And I want to hear a little bit about what you learned from one another or yourselves, or that was shared in your room. Is anybody willing to share your list or some of them, or a piece of the conversation that you had in your room with the larger group? You can chat or unmute yourself, whatever feels most comfortable.
I'll start, Carrie. I would say that even though the typical way to do this was to just ask each person what their traits were. And I sort of, because I had a group of students, said to them, listen for the similarities. So as we found things that we found common, the next person would talk about those things. And we wrapped up by my asking another question, and that was, what traits or what characteristics of yours are you most proud of? Or which ones have been ones that you struggled with in society? So most of the time, my group mentioned their accomplishments as the things they were most proud of. So that's kind of a summation.
Thanks. Someone else, what did you talk about in your group, or are you willing to share your list with us?
Yeah, sure. Okay, go ahead.
I'm willing to share part of my list.
All right, thanks, Bridget. And then Rodrigo, I saw you pop in. You can go next.
All right. So for my list, my name is Bridget, but I normally just do the B for my family. And I am white. I am the oldest of 5 kids in my family. I'm a female. I would say that my regional identity is Nebraskan because I grew up in Omaha. I'm an introvert. I'm a 3rd year here in the 5-year track. I'm a planning student. And my, I'd say I'm an introvert. My friends say I'm an extrovert. And the word that people use to describe me that's most important to me is kind.
Thanks, Bridget. I appreciate that. All right, Rodrigo, was that you who had something to say a minute ago?
Yeah, I mean, my list is definitely not as long as your guys's, but I have male, young adult, Mexican, son, friend, student, cook, caretaker, brother, and youngest sibling.
Oh, nice. Thanks. Anybody else?
I guess I'll speak up. I'm a male, half Colombian, half American. Married, 2 kids. I'm a brother. I'm an uncle. I'm a cousin. I'm a dad. I'm a grandson. I grew up in rural Kansas, a very small community. And I consider myself a cook, a baker, an artist, an athlete, and that's my list.
Thanks. Anybody else? Last chance. Going once, going twice. I think I should get to have a gavel for these. All right.
can share.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, nope. Go ahead. Nope, I see you. Go ahead.
One of the things that I shared in our group was that for me, my identity has shifted as where I lived has changed. So foremost, I think of myself now as a woman of color, but I didn't grow up thinking of myself that way. I think that I grew up in India. I did my undergrad in India, and then I moved to the US. And my identity as a woman of color particularly has developed as I've moved to the US. And it has become probably the most important part of my identity to me now. But then when I go back to India, it shifts, you know. And I thought that was an interesting, that shift in our identity is like an interesting thing to reflect on. In our group, we also shared how our identity is given to us in some ways from our family and how we grow up, and how the identity that our family wants to have us to have. A lot of us shared how our family wants us to be educated and go to school and be successful, and how that's part of our identity now.
Such insightful comments. I saw so many heads nodding as you were talking about the shifting of identities based on who we're around or where we are in the world or the country. Would anybody else like to speak to that about the changing nature of identity for you, or what that's like?
One thing that I've been thinking about as we've been talking is how your name is such an important part of your identity, and like nicknames that come from that, of like my family and certain friends will call me certain nicknames, and it feels weird if other people call me that. Like one of my friends' mom would call me Susie, and she was the only person who was ever allowed to do that. And it's like the way that people will nickname you kind of makes you feel closer to them, but it could feel like fake or ingenuine when people use like certain nicknames to you, or call you mispronounce your name or something like that. And so the way that your name connects to your identity and makes you feel part of yourself, I think, is super important.
Oh, absolutely. And to your point about identities that you claim for yourself versus identities that other people put on you, that can change how even you feel about that part of your. Is it something you've embraced? Is it something that you're proud of? Is it something that you wave that flag around, or is it something that you struggle with? Is it something that you keep quiet? Is it something that you're grappling with, how that identity intersects with your life? Yeah, it's complex for sure. Other comments about identity that you have, or what came up in your group that was interesting? And then I want to come back to a question that LB asked. When we make these lists, when we are asked to sit for a moment, and it wasn't a long moment, life is frantic and things are coming at us all the time, and we rarely have moments of pause. Rarely is there a moment of just quiet, a moment of reflection. We are all navigating our lives and our work and our relationships, and our new relationships with these masks on our faces, and the distance that we have and feel with other people. You know, I live in a city and I love being around people. But now when I go to the grocery store, I feel like I'm at war. I mean, it's this sense of don't come near me and how do I keep distance? I don't like the feeling of just another person walking toward me on the sidewalk and me thinking, all right, how can I navigate this? And do they have a mask on? Are they breathing in I don't like that. And so as we begin to navigate all of this, taking some time to consider who we are in all of this is powerful and is important in this process. And so in LaBarbara's group, they talked about these identities that you're proud of or ones that you struggle with. And so the question I would pose to the group is, what can be difficult about even making a list like this? What's hard about putting pen to paper or typing a list in when asked to categorize think through what groups you're a part of? Why is that hard? Right when we all came back into the room, I think it was Rodrigo who asked me, what's your list? And I thought, oh shoot, I've been asking people to make their list and I didn't write mine down, and let me quickly think through that. What can be hard about both making the inventory, taking inventory of that, or sharing any of that? Why is that difficult? Because I know that it is. Oh, here's a good comment in the chat from the dean. Lists are by nature exclusionary. Yes, they don't allow for explanation. It's just a word, and that might mean something to someone else. If you put this, it might mean you're not that. Yeah, that's one of the things absolutely that makes this complicated and can be hard about it. What else is hard about it?
You have to, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Amber.
You have to think about all the ways that you're different, which can be difficult.
Yes. Oscar, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that I think we just set up like these standards that we have to meet for certain criteria, and if we don't in some regard, then we don't acknowledge that we are.
That is absolutely true.
I think also, particularly by that identity and kind of trying to list how we identify ourselves, it makes us vulnerable because not all identities are treated equal, or, you know, you're essentially outing yourself in some ways and saying, this is how I see myself, or this is who I am. And that's not always acceptable to other people. And I think it can make you really vulnerable.
I think vulnerable is a key word in this. You're right. It is laying yourself bare. It is saying this is who I am. And, you know, some things are visible to other people. And, you know, we couldn't keep it a secret if we wanted to. But other things are internal, and we know that there may be consequences to sharing that, or we may get pushback, or someone may question that identity if we claim it for ourselves. So you're absolutely right when you talk about vulnerability. I want to talk about what Andrew put in the chat, that as designers, there's a struggle with perfectionism. And there is such complexity to who we are, that to try to make this list of, you know, characteristics, it's never going to be enough, right? A list is never going to capture all of who you are. There's no way to put into enough words what would paint the beautiful picture of you. We are so much more than our individual identities and experiences. The way that those things intersect, the way that they're woven together, the way that they bleed into one another, is what crafts and creates your you-ness. And you're right, just trying to make a list itself, especially when You know, you are designers and builders and creators and artists. It can be hard to do that because you are laying yourself bare and being vulnerable about so many pieces, for sure. What else can be difficult about it?
Carrie, I want to go back to something that Sush had said earlier, that as you think about your list, as circumstances in your life come up, it changes. And what you think you are when you are a certain age may have changed, but you haven't come to recognize it. So as you go through life, perhaps get some more wisdom, or just have something horrible that happens to you, it changes how you think of yourself, so that time really does affect the list. And you have to be really aware of what may float to the top of the definition, as opposed to remain in the middle that describes yourself. And then there's the layer, as you said before, of how you think of yourself as opposed to how you have allowed other people to think of you. So if you let other people define you, that makes a difference based on the experiences that you have later in life.
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah. Sometimes the difficulty in thinking through this and making your list and claiming identities for yourself is what you all have already said, in terms of it can be vulnerable, and there are things that you may not be comfortable yet sharing out loud, or even admitting to yourself that this is a part of who you are. So it can be difficult to grapple with that. Another piece of it is there is a sense that we shouldn't brag about ourselves. So the opposite side of, you know, maybe feeling anxiety or shame or guilt about some part of our identity is also the quieting of our magnificence, and the sense that we should dim some of who we are for other people's comfortability, or because we've been told to be less of that, you know, don't be extra, don't be. And so we in order to fit into the spaces in which we're trying to navigate, often we tamp down some pieces of who we are. In order to have people think we're not right, we downplay gifts, talents, experiences that make us who we are. We should never have to apologize for our presence, for our strength, for our voice, for our gifts and our talents. So in thinking through this claiming of who you are, of how your identity does help define how you walk through the world, we're battling a both and, trying to navigate the things that we're working on and that feel weighty to us, or the things that bring us such joy or peace or connection, in thinking about how do we bring all of that together. So it can be hard, it can be difficult on both sides. It's never a complete list. There's, you know, it continues to change and shift. And something that LaBarbara said about at different, you know, phases in your life, I said when I rattled off my list as you all were coming back in, prior to my parents dying, I would have talked about, oh, I'm a daughter, and I had this wonderful relationship with my parents. And now, like, when my father died first, when my mother died several years ago, the word orphan popped into my head. And I thought, you know, at the time I was like, I'm 39 years old. Orphans are children. But I was like, no, like suddenly that was an identity for me. Like I felt parentless. And so that shifted for me. And so I think that happens to a lot of people as life circumstances change, as relationships shift, as careers change, as you move and live within different cultures. You know, you may feel like a person of color here, but not back in your home country. You know, as she shared with us, that those shifts are part of what we navigate as we go through this. So thinking about our own filters, the fullness, all of who you are, not only impacts how you're seeing other people. You know, we started off by talking about the biases that we all have, the ways in which we view other people and the world, but they also impact how we see ourselves. And sometimes the way we see ourselves impacts how we see other people. And as we think through the hopefulness that I talked about at the beginning, that we do have the ability and, in fact, the responsibility to manage, to navigate our unconscious biases. They are a part of who we are, but it doesn't mean they control us. It doesn't mean we abdicate all responsibility of just saying, well, that's a filter that I have. That's the experience I have had. And so that's how I view this group of people or this experience or this identity group. We do have a bigger responsibility to pause as we know that we're entering into situations where we are in a place of making a judgment. And again, judgment can be one of those pejorative, negative, or like, oh, I don't want to judge people. But we do frequently. We are judging, deciding, making value decisions about who we let into our lives and who we don't, about who we work with and who we don't, who we promote, who we don't, who we support and who we don't. Taking a pause, taking a moment to consider, are any of my filters at play when I'm making a choice about these decisions that I'm making? And when we do that, when we take some time to identify what those filters are, if we know we've had bad experiences with XYZ, if we're having a reaction to someone or something, asking yourself, why do I feel this way? Why am I having this reaction? And if we can ask that question and consider honestly, then we begin to be able to address what some of our own unconscious biases are. They begin to come a little more into our consciousness. So simply knowing that this is a part of what happens as interactive human beings gives us the ability, the knowledge, the tools to be able to think through it. You all don't live and operate and work and learn in a vacuum. You do it in community. You do it with one another. You do it in collaborative projects, in relationships. And so one of the pieces thinking about community, as we talk about unconscious bias, as we go about the work of building an inclusive, just, equitable community, it's about asking that we all, that one another, consider what some of our biases might be. This work of understanding inclusion is continual work. It's some lifelong dig into, and sometimes it just starts with some verbal agreement, some verbal understanding of, hey, as we're making some decisions and choices, let's think about why we're making them and what is coming into play with our decisions. Talk to one another about it. We have talked so often this week about the power of individual stories, the power of knowing another person's perspective, and how when you begin to understand some of that filter, some of their own backgrounds, it's powerful in a way that you all can connect with one another. That's a piece that we can take moving forward, is to start with ourselves, think about our own filters and experiences, and think about the identities that we claim for ourselves, but also engage in that with one another. Ask that of one another, to have those conversations, to look critically at any group that you draw together. Do we have broad perspectives? Have we fallen victim to some of these types of biases, like, I'm going to pull those back up, like, affinity bias, or some of the pieces that might keep us from being more broad in our understanding of other people and how we do that. So if we're able to look around and think, you know, is confirmation bias at play here? Is affinity bias at play? Are we, have I gathered people around and just said, no, these are just the right people? Is it because you agree with them? Is it because they're like you? Is it because you've had previous negative perceptions of them or people that you think they may be like? Be bold enough to ask those questions of yourself, of others, and think through that as you all go about this work of building your professional careers and relationships. What final comments or questions do you have? What are your thoughts about this whole idea of unconscious bias and how it comes to play in your work and learning? Are there places in architecture and planning and design that you see these filters come into play?
Carrie, this is Tim. Kind of wondering about the role empathy plays in this, and just wondering if you might touch on that, because we certainly see a fair amount of lack of empathetic responses these days. And
Good question. You know, empathy is about taking time to consider another's perspective, taking time to, you know, walk a mile in someone else's shoes, to consider someone else's experiences. I think it plays a huge role in our ability to recognize our own biases. It goes back to that grounding understanding of each person's dignity, that each person has worth and value, even when we deeply, greatly struggle with them, even when we might disagree on every front. Coming at problems or groups or relationships with a sense of empathy, I think it can be empowering. It can help see us clear to consider other people's perspectives in a way we wouldn't have before. And sometimes we shift from judgmental to understanding. Sometimes we shift from negative perceptions to more understanding ones. I think empathy plays a huge role.
I've got a quick question, Carrie,
Sure.
if you don't mind. So I was just kind of reflecting on this, and I'm just curious to say, like, you know, is it actually these identities that serve these unconscious bias, or is it the way these identities are presented? So for an example, like, you know, the LGBTQ movement, Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of these movements have negative connotation behind it because of the way that they are portrayed. So for example, you know, the BLM with all like the rioting, looting, all that, you know, with the LGBTQ movement, you know, not a whole lot of like rioting and stuff, but just people don't know about it. So would you think that just the presentation of it is what is causing these biases? So instead of saying, oh, you know, I'm part of the LGBTQ movement and leaving it at that, someone might think, you know, associate that with the true identity, or I guess their perceived identity of that movement. However, if you say it like, you know, I am part of the LGBTQ movement, therefore I have expertise in, you know, the interaction between these people, that obviously comes off as a way different, you know, perception. And, you know, say you're in an interview, that could come off as a potential benefit for, you know, for that employer, rather than, you know, having that perceived connotation beforehand.
That's a great question. And I think that brings us to the point that identities are both internal and external. They are both individual and corporate. And it does come down to individual perceptions And so what one person may perceive of as positive or negative of an identity is going to be the opposite reaction that another person has. And so it's all of the above. It is both how we see it and how we embrace it or how we present it to the world. It's both public and private. A lot of it comes down to in messages that we have internalized versus external messages that we're receiving from a variety of sources. If you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement this summer, and depending on what Twitter feed you were looking at, or what news channel you were watching, or whose responses you were given, the language was wildly different about the exact same event. And so that's just one example. Even the use of language about rioting and looting comes from a specific perspective as opposed to protesting. And so the photos that are used, headlines that are written, they all impact people's filter through which they see. So if we're only getting one perspective, it absolutely impacts it. So
Awesome.
I think it's all of the above.
Okay. Well, yeah, because I just kind of noticed this. I mean, I'm going to use Jin and Sush just for an example. But considering that they have different backgrounds than a lot of us, this whole unconscious bias thing comes in. But the fact that they have portrayed themselves as an asset, they have brought, their knowledge and everything to this university. And I think, Jen and Sush are just a living example that, unconscious bias can be overturned if presented the correct way. Because just from personal experience, Sush and Jen have been very, very influential professors toward me. And it's not from any of their background, but it's how they, interact with us like as students, and they portray knowledge very well, and they pass on their knowledge to, how we can understand it, and they actually take an active interest in all that. And none of the background stuff matters at that time. If anything, it helps it because they have experienced a different culture from a different perspective, and now we have obtained that knowledge. And that's, that's obviously a good thing, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's interesting that a single interaction, again, it adds to our filters. It adds layers even to our. Remember, biases can be good or bad. They can be positive or negative. And so, if the only person you have ever met or interacted with from a particular identity group, whether it's someone of a particular faith or race or nationality, or career choice, if you have had an extremely positive experience with that person, then you tend to think more highly of everyone that you would put in that group. If you have a single negative experience with one person and you attribute that experience to their identity, if you have a terrible experience with one dentist, oh, it was awful, then you might go, oh, all dentists are the worst, they're monsters, and you attribute that to them being a dentist, not them being a terrible human being. And so you're right, with every interaction there's continual refiling in our brains about how we feel about people. It's why representation matters so much. In the public forum, it matters in education, it matters in leadership. How we see people being portrayed on television shows and in movies, who's teaching classes, what kind of people do elementary school kids have leading their classrooms, who are the decision makers, in representation matters because it allows us to refile, to reshift, some childhood, back to the science, we start some of these filters in middle to early childhood. And it comes from messages we're getting. And so if all we get is a single message, then that becomes where we filed that, and that's a judgment we make about it. The broader your experience becomes with different types of people and identities, it really does begin to reorder some of those things, and being aware of that is so important. Yeah, good question, good conversation. Does anyone else have a parting thought for us as we finish up our time together? I want to pull up a quote by Toni Morrison and let you see some words that she has for us, as you all both are professionals already and are working toward that. Toni Morrison, in one of the final iterations of her career, was as a professor. She taught at Wake Forest. And so she says this: I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you've been so brilliantly trained for, remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. And part of the way that we do that is by dedicating time, thought, energy into how we interact with other people, acknowledging influence that we have. How can we actively, purposefully, intentionally consider how we are labeling other people, how we are viewing identities, how we can navigate both the positive and negative thoughts that we have about identity groups and individuals, and consider all of the spheres in which you have influence, and looking around and thinking, how can I exercise more inclusion, more understanding, pushing employers and businesses and leaders with which you interact to consider these topics and really work toward it in a corporate culture and an educational culture. It matters a great deal. It can shift the needle forward. I have so appreciated this conversation today, and I'm grateful for you all as always and your input. I know it's a busy week and there's a lot going on, but thank you for your wisdom and your perspective and your vulnerability and sharing pieces of who you are with everyone else in the group. We have one more day of this week of programming, but the conversations will continue long after this week. This is a starting point for more dialogue, more conversations, more questions, more stories. But tomorrow we have workshops on navigating mental health in the age of COVID that we're in. We're going to do this workshop again. We have a second conversation tomorrow about unconscious bias. And we're also going to have a conversation about freedom of speech, academic freedom versus freedom of speech, and how we navigate that realm in which we find ourselves. So I would love to see you again tomorrow at any one of our workshops. So thanks for your participation and input. Do any of our faculty have a final word or announcement or thing they need to share with us?
Thank you, Carrie. And I would really encourage the faculty and students that if you thought today's was a good session, to encourage your classmates, your colleagues to participate tomorrow in one or all of the different sessions tomorrow, because we do have a real gem in having Carrie share her insights with us. She's been just an amazing person in helping us to guide us through these things. So thank you, Carrie.
Thank you all. Or you can also come back to this one again and sound super smart in front of everybody else. You can like say the things before I said them, and everybody in the group's going to think you're a genius. So you can come back to this one again tomorrow if you want to.
Thank you, Carrie.
All right. Thank you all so much.
I think stop recording.